Welcome to the Fat Murder Podcast, where I'll be discussing your deep psychological relationship with food and share with you how to get into the best shape of your life through the power of habit. I'm your host, Leslie Hooper. Today, I'm super excited to announce I have a former client, Jessie Fink, here in the house with me today. Jessie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I am so excited to have you on because you and I work together. And I know before I hit the record button, I was kind of teasing you because I was like, hey, Jessie, it might be time to wrap up the coaching here. Like, I feel like you're good, but there was a little bit of hesitation there. But what do you think it was? The final timeline was around 18 months?
Yes. It was a bit over a year and a half. So
yeah. And then I think it was early this year, 2021, that you did finally, maybe after the holidays, be like, all right, I got this. I'm going to expand my wings and do this damn thing on my own successfully. But what's unique about your story is a few things. Number one, you work in the food industry. So I know that you are surrounded by food 24/7. As someone who is a dieter, that can be a pretty triggering environment. And then number two, you also had a wedding coming up. Number three, you had COVID to deal with. So there were a lot of challenges that you were kind of encountering while going through this coaching process together. So I want to make sure that we touch on each one of those in this podcast because I think it's what really makes your story unique and different from previous client interviews. But can you go ahead and just start by telling our listeners a little bit about you, your age, location, and of course, your dieting background?
absolutely. So yes, I'm Jessie. I'm 31. I live in New York City, Brooklyn, to be specific. And yeah, I wouldn't say that I had a long dieting history. I was lucky to not grow up in a household where I was shamed for eating food. My dieting history really came during college when it was a freshman 15 situation. And I was like, oh, guess I got to figure out how to take this off, which, I did. And I think college kind of started all the different changes in life. You go to college, you study abroad, you move to the city, you get a new job, deal with different schedules. So I think I kind of evolved my dieting throughout that time period.
Jessie, would you say that you became more body conscious in college? Like maybe going through your teen years, maybe not really feeling so insecure in your body or like something was wrong with it, we needed to change it. But the freshman 15 sounds like maybe it brought some awareness to something for you that you felt like, oh shit, this is a problem. Like I need to do something about it. And who taught you how to diet?
So to answer your first question, yes. I think going to college and, taking pictures of yourself all the time, like that's just, something I didn't do in high school or growing up. And, I also played sports in high school. I was really active. So finally, you go to college and you start drinking more and you start hanging out and having more free time and long nights in the library. And that combined with all the pictures and, maybe friends who didn't have the upbringing that I did, who were a lot more body conscious and kind of, put that on everybody else. So that was a combo of it. And then, my mom actually taught me how to diet. It's funny saying it now because she, to her credit, is a lifelong dieter and is one of those people who really does stick to it. When you talk about like the half a grapefruit for breakfast, the single serving of yogurt for lunch, she's just done it. Like that's her habit and that's great for her. And she, taught me how to do it too. And I thought I could do that for the rest of my life.
Do you think that your mom is actually like a dieter? Do you feel like feels restricted and deprived? Or do you feel like she's someone who just read like dieting content and then like turned it into a lifestyle, a habit, and she's just been able to like maintain it because she's like, oh, well, this makes sense. Like she's one of these anomalies, right? Like these people that are like a unicorn who's like reads one diet book, maybe loses a little bit of weight and then just like sticks to it and doesn't feel
Exactly.
the restriction. Yeah.
She's the unicorn. She's the one everyone thinks that we can be when we're, reading all the Instagram posts and reading the books and everything. And we're like, oh, you just got to do that. No problem. And so she actually does it and, made it look really easy. So I thought I could do it too. Well, rather, she's not even dieting anymore, to your point. Right. It's really just a lifestyle.
Yeah. So where do you think things went a little bit wrong for you then? Because you did grow up in a home of basically non-dieters. I mean, you were similar to my story, high school, maybe an athlete, and grew up with a home and parents that had pretty healthy relationship with food. So where did things go sideways?
I think, the dieting, once it kind of starts, it's hard to stop it. I had friends who did Weight Watchers, so I tried that. I had friends who did keto, so I tried that. And, it becomes a bonding thing with friends. If you have a friend who's doing, no carbs this month, then, oh, you want to do it together? Okay, sure. So I think I kind of just got into it deeper and deeper without even noticing. And then, obviously the more you think about it, the more focused on it you are. And even though, I can't say that my body was ever, out of control or too big or, I've had the same clothes for the past like 10 years. So it's not like I've ever fluctuated so much. It just became such a ever-present thought in my head, and I just really couldn't stop thinking about it. Yeah. And so that was kind of a trigger for me to be like, I can't do this for the rest of my life.
Okay. So you mentioned that it's something that you started, and I am in complete agreement with your thought around once you start, you kind of can't quit, because I have never really met a dieter who has started and then just been like, you know what, this is too hard. I tap out. I'm okay with being in maybe a larger body. That's what they think is going to happen, by the way, because this is actually my story that we're touching on here. I am one of those people that literally was just like, you know what? I was not a binge eater throughout high school and college. It wasn't until like in my 20s when I started going to the gym and got more immersed in gym culture so I remembered a life before dieting, and I'm just like, how do I get back to that person? I will do anything to get back to that person, because pizza was not stressful. Ice cream was not stressful, but I was so afraid of food through my years of dieting. I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how, you acquire so much information, you basically paint yourself into a corner and don't really know how to get out of it. And I can literally remember a evening where I was crying myself to sleep, just like, how do I stop this? And then I did. I was just like, you know what? Even if I weigh 10, 15, 20, 30 more pounds, there's no way that can be more miserable than being in this current existence. And I was afraid to admit that to myself, because that obviously meant that I was never going to get married. It meant that I was never going to be successful in my job. All these dreams that I had in my thinner body were now going up into flames, because I was basically what felt like to me quitting on, giving up. You're a loser, you're giving up on this. But I wasn't.
Well, isn't that exactly what society says to us? I can remember relatives and parents and, other people looking at an overweight person being like, wow, they really let themselves go. That's implying that eating naturally is going to equal you being really fat. And so that's what we learn over the course of our lives.
Well, but I would argue if you look at generations, like my grandmother's generation, my mother's generation, that was not the case. Portions looked very different. The mindset back then was very different. Even the dieting back then, actually, I don't know that dieting was even a thing in my grandma's generation. This is a pretty new development. If you think in the grand scheme of things, dieting wasn't happening 100 years ago. but
No,
it's
nobody had the
still
budget. They
more.
could barely put food on the table.
Yeah, exactly. And like they were growing it in their backyard. So they sure as shit weren't going to sit around eating in front of the TV. That was also the era of like the Leave It to Beaver, where everybody did sit around the dinner table. And that's a habit that I say all the time. I'm so grateful that I was raised in a home with parents that valued that quality connection time. At the end of the day, we did sit around the table. But that doesn't happen nowadays. Nowadays the portions are triple what they were back then. So no wonder we're all bigger because we're eating triple the amount, especially if you came from a background with a habit of like cleaning your plate. It's disastrous. But
Yeah. And the getting back to eating at the table, I had a similar experience where we always did that growing up. And I got away from that, in my dieting days. Because, college, and then living in New York City where you don't have a dining room table, like all of that kind of stuff. And then since we work together, your importance that you place on eating at a table really, helped me a lot because, food is special. You should enjoy it. It shouldn't be just like shoved in your face on the way out the door.
Right. All right. Let's shift gears a little bit because I mentioned earlier that you obviously, when we first started working together, had a wedding date and COVID hit, which was a big bummer because that meant wedding date needed to change. And we had to kind of navigate that together. Although at that point you were doing a pretty good job of doing this on your own, I will say, but I know that was a really hard decision for you. But I'm curious, Jesse, was that the catalyst for you signing up to work with me, or was there like another reason? Because there's always like a pain point with people when they feel quote unquote desperate enough to reach out to a coach, right? Like I always joke around about me being the last resort. Like you've tried all the dieting, you're like, this chick sounds crazy enough that it could work. So I am going to take a leap of faith here and reach out to her. But can you explain what it was for you that was like, I need to take action on this?
Definitely. So I think I actually reached out to you before I was engaged.
Did you?
I think so. Yeah. Cause we started working together June 2019 and I got engaged in end of October.
Okay.
So it was shortly before. And I can remember I had started following you on Instagram and literally just like saw you on the explore page, like, did not get recommended by anybody. It was
fate, Jesse.
It was fate. So I had been following you for a little bit and I, very different. Your content's totally different from all the other, like, just do this. It's easy. And you were like, I remember there was one, it was like, you can't diet yourself strong and you can't exercise yourself skinny.
Yeah.
And I was like, damn, like hot take. I never heard that before. Yeah. So I think I followed you for a little bit. And then, I was at that point, I wasn't full on dieting. Like I wasn't like tracking my calories to a T, but I was trying to just kind of be as like healthy as possible. And I think one night I just like emotionally ate. I had no idea what triggered me. I was just like, I had been doing so well, being so healthy, exercising. And then all of a sudden I forget exactly what it was, but it was like I finished a pint of ice cream, like sleeve of cookies, something where I just knew I didn't want them, but something took over and I was just out of control. And I was like, you know what? Like, I just can't do this anymore. Like I had a feeling it had something to do with like all the diets I had tried, but I just knew I needed something different because I can't continue my life like this. And, being in food and working in food, like I obviously knew about I thought I knew a lot about nutrition or healthy living, wellness. And then seeing your content, I was like, wow, that's totally different and not something really related to nutrition. Really just, it was just like that other level that you were kind of getting at. And little did I know, but I learned quickly. So yeah, I think that was the catalyst. And then, I'm really glad in retrospect that we did start working together because obviously wedding and then COVID and rescheduling the wedding and all of that. It was so necessary and nice to have you to talk to and kind of troubleshoot things with. Cause, honestly, life's hard anyway, and
Yeah,
COVID's hard, and
definitely.
trying to form new habits and really question yourself. Yeah, that would have been pretty difficult to do alone.
Well, especially because you're in a work environment where you were eating restaurant food that's being provided to you for some of your meals throughout. And I think that was actually a really helpful practice because you were immediately like thrusted into a challenging environment. Most people would be like eating restaurant food every single day. Like I would wake up 300 pounds heavier, but the reality is like, no, you won't.
And I think that's what attracted me to working with you too. And, realizing that a diet really isn't possible because like, how am I supposed to know how many calories are in the food that I'm eating? Like, I'm not making it. And honestly, I'm not going to turn down this amazing food for lunch. Like, I'm not going to bring a peanut butter sandwich if I can get like sushi made to order for free. That's silly. So yeah, it was always going to need to be you.
So let's talk a little bit about the action piece because most people never will take action because they fear that this is just going to be another weight loss program that they fail at. I mean, if you've been dieting for 10, 20, 30 years, it's very hard to believe that there is a different path to where you could actually be successful with weight loss in a way that doesn't require you to tell yourself no all the time or count your macros or follow this meal plan. I mean, it feels like a fantasy. So why didn't you feel that way, Jessie? Like, what was it that made you think or believe in yourself that was like, you know what, I think I can do this? Or I don't know what she's talking about exactly, but I'm going to just like trust her.
For me, I think it was like the new experiences that I was feeling. For anybody who's listening to this, like your program isn't like without struggles, I mean,
No.
like, yeah, okay, you can eat whatever you want. But it's honestly just like so much more difficult when you're not doing restrictions or creating rules that are like so surface level. Like I just realized that I ate a lot when I wasn't hungry. And so dealing with that and actually tackling that's kind of where it clicked for me, where it's like, okay, these are things I've never taken the time to think about before. I'm actually feeling hunger every day, like multiple times a day, because it became weird to eat if I wasn't hungry.
Mhm.
And so those are the kinds of little like cues or whatever you want to call them, like indicators that, this is not only just like a different program, but it's actually a program that is more impactful than just another diet.
Well, I mean, we didn't really spend a whole lot of time talking about the food or the habits. That's pretty black and white. What we spend most of the time on our calls talking about, we're like, hey, Jessie, tell me about your past week. What were some of your eating challenges? I'm noticing here on your chart, you mentioned happy hour with friends or a birthday celebration on Saturday night, and maybe a few too many cocktails, which led to some, I don't know, maybe overeating the following day. Like those are the things that we talk about. It's not so much like do this, don't do that, because that's just another diet at the end of the day.
Right. And it's so much more about like my actions and my thoughts and
Yes.
yeah, just like how one thing leads to another and how I would only notice it because of how I was eating.
Right.
And it's funny, like, why did I overeat that day? Oh, well, I got 5 assignments in an hour that I had to finish. Probably was a little stressed. Or I remember there was like a turning point where you asked me how much sleep I got every night. And it turns out I was only getting like 6 hours of sleep because I would just like, stay up late. I have to get up pretty early for my job. And you were like, can you like promise at least 7 hours of sleep? Because, 5 to 6 hours just isn't enough. And I think it was that kind of stuff, like the self-care stuff that paid off in dividends. And so, yeah, you're right. Like that's not food stuff. That's just like being nicer to myself stuff.
So you mentioned some of the challenges, and I think it is a good point to bring up that and be totally transparent. Like, this isn't easy in the same way that dieting isn't easy. The difference is you get to pick your hard. One of them actually leads to long-term, permanent food freedom and like never having to diet again. And yes, the difficulty is temporary, but everybody has to get to it to get to the other side. It is just a necessary part of the process. Or you can continue to endure traveling down this path of dieting where the reality is like you've been doing it and you still haven't seen a light at the end of the tunnel. So like, what's the plan here? Are we just going to keep banging our head against the wall? Or at some point, are we going to have the courage to maybe try something different, to try something new, and be open to learning and growing and being a student again? Because a lot of you listeners have been lifetime dieters. They're professional they are expert dieters. So they know all the things. And so they come into the program knowing all the things. But like, we're not asking you to know the things. We want you to leave that shit at the door and be open to like a completely new way of being. But I want to know what your challenges were, Jessie.
I think my challenges were a lot of the things that I didn't think mattered. So for example, I remember we used to watch TV at dinner time.
Oh, yeah.
And it was one of those things where I was like, okay, I'm like plating my food and I'm eating at the table, but the TV would still be on. And I think it took me a few months. I'm like embarrassed to say how long it took for me to like
That's
actually
totally
make
normal
things
for
click.
clients to be super resistant to that. Yeah, completely.
And that's like, I didn't even notice. And I didn't even think that it would be a big deal. But then I was kind of like, wait a minute, like I'm finding myself not focusing on what I'm doing, aka eating. And it took me a long time. So that was a challenge. I think, yeah, just like the little things, like the size of the plate. You know, when I finally did get the 9-inch plates, it made all the difference. And again, like now I'm flexible. I mean, I actually do like my 9-inch plates because they're really nice plates. But, you know, now I'm a little bit more flexible. If I'm out to dinner, obviously you have to be flexible and that kind of thing. But I didn't realize how kind of like leaning into it as much as I needed to was going to benefit me.
Good.
I think that's part of why it took me a little bit longer.
Why do you think you were resistant initially? Because obviously we lay out the recommendations because we've worked with thousands of clients before you, right? And so like I know what works. Look, I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I don't think is going to benefit you long term, right? But we are still so resistant to change in the beginning because we also are lifelong dieters. So we know about what portions we need because we've been calorie counting or macro counting. So like, what was it for you that made you feel like resistant to taking that on? And sometimes it's about like having an uncomfortable conversation with a partner. It's like, hey, we're changing like our evening ritual. How do you feel about
it? Yeah, I think that had to do with it. I think that definitely had a lot to do with it. It's like, thought it was just kind of something that I could do by myself.
Yeah.
And, you know, the changes of like, hey, we're getting smaller plates, or hey, like I really would prefer if we could just sit at the table and not watch TV. And, you know, you kind of have to go out of your way. And I think it's great because I think it makes it more, you know, just intentional. But that being said, I think it actually kind of goes back to the whole taking care of myself thing that you taught me very well. But, you know, I didn't want to be a bother. You know, I didn't want to disrupt anything because that's just very much used to be very much my MO, still is. Who am I kidding?
People pleasing.
Yeah. Recovering people pleaser here. So yeah, I think that was a big part of it. I just didn't want to rock the boat too much, which is silly because how many diets was I on where it's like, I'm not eating carbs this month. And like, I have to buy all new chickpea pasta and whatever. So.
And your husband endured a lot of your wacky dieting ideas or supported you through those. Of course, he was probably going to be cool with like, this, at least we get to eat whatever we want tonight. We just have to do it at the table.
Oh yeah. He isn't that always the way. You always anticipate
Yes.
people's reactions to be worse than they are. He was totally fine with it. He's of course incredibly supportive. So it was just all in my head. And now I know, and glad I kind of
And I love the eating at the table as a couple or a family at the end of the day. It just, to me, feels like a special time, especially nowadays when we're just so busy. I hate that word, but like we're so busy and we just do not make time to slow down and be present with the food, with the family, and just connect, have a conversation. And it's not even like it takes much time. It's not like this is robbing you of your TV time, or especially nowadays with like DVRs and streaming. It's like you don't miss
plenty of time. Yeah.
I know.
And not for
when
nothing,
I was a kid, I was like, this is what time the television show comes on. Like I got to be done eating by this time, because like you miss it,
Totally. And yeah, not for nothing, but since we started working together, the food that I make is way better. So all the more reason to sit down and enjoy it and, focus on it.
Do you feel like because there aren't the rules that you can't have the carbs or you can't have the sugar, that you've been a lot more experimental in the kitchen? And as somebody who works in the restaurant industry, has that just kind of unlocked a door of freedom for you where you can just maybe find a lot more pleasure and enjoyment around food that wasn't there beforehand?
Oh, absolutely. I feel like I would basically rule out categories of food at work before. Like I wouldn't try I would just eat salads all the time. But then the problem is that then I would get hungry an hour later and like inhale a cup of granola. It's like, that's honestly, so now I just have like a normal lunch, whatever I'm interested in, whether it's like sushi or pizza or barbecue or, we have like rotisserie, everything honestly is available to me. And now I just eat my lunch and it's amazing. And I eat something different every day and it's great. I don't eat too much of it and I don't eat anything else until I get hungry later for dinner. And so, yeah, I get so much more pleasure out of trying new things, and the food, I just enjoy it more when I am eating it because I'm not thinking about something else or thinking about like, like how many calories are in this. And then cooking too, cooking used to be, like how can I substitute every ingredient in this recipe to make it the healthiest it possibly can be.
Right.
And now it's like, I'm just going to make it.
It's like the lowest calorie. It's not
exactly. Or lowest carb.
We use the word healthy, but what we really mean is the lowest calorie way to eat this.
Oh yeah. Like vegan things that do not need to be vegan. Like there's nothing wrong with putting an egg in something. But of course I know that now, but try and tell me that several years ago and I was not ready for it. So yeah, I'd say like my relationship with food just kind of has changed so much and for the better. And I honestly don't think, if anything, I'm consuming fewer calories because I'm not just eating all the time like I used to, even though it was like quote unquote healthy food that I was eating all the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it's easy to justify that handful of almonds when you're walking through the kitchen or grabbing a handful of baby carrots. I mean, it's diet food. It's healthy. It's whole foods, right? So like these calories don't really matter. All right. I have another question for you, Jessie. Did you ever think throughout this process about quitting or giving up? I mean, coming into this, you were a bit of a perfectionist, and we briefly touched on your people-pleasing ways, which I've also learned through my years of coaching. It's very easy to spot my people-pleasing clients because a lot of them kind of perform for you, the coach, and it's easy to be like, all right, come on, we got the perfectionism and the people-pleasing duo here. That's a challenging place to live, I would say, because there is a lot of mask wearing that needs to happen and the mask can start to slip. So tell me, did you ever want to quit or give up?
100%. I did. Not like 100% of the time, but like at different stages. Because I think, and you kind of told me this as well, like It is like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back
Yes.
kind of process.
It's like therapy. Sometimes you got to go through quite a bit of pain. Sometimes it gets worse before it gets better.
Yeah. And so I think, right in the beginning, I remember like a couple weeks into it, I was like, why can I not do this? And you're like, you literally just started. So I think in the beginning, I was a little like, wait, why isn't this catching on so quick? So I was a little nervous about that. And then, I'll be honest, you see friends who are like, oh, I lost 20 pounds. And
yes,
especially during COVID, it was like people lost all this weight. Nobody saw each other for a long time. And then you find like we did rotations at work. So I would not be on the same rotation with somebody. And then finally I saw them after a few months and they would have lost so much weight. And, then I am kind of like developing my habits. Like I hadn't gained any weight. I had lost a little bit of weight, but nothing like as magical as
dramatic.
These 20 pounds. And, I think those are the moments where you kind of had to like slap me back into reality and remind me that nobody loses 20 pounds and just keeps it off like without some serious something.
You can't lose 20 pounds in a couple of months and think that's going to be sustainable. Somebody's doing something very drastic if that's what's happening. And I would actually like an update on them, Jessie. Like, what's the latest with this individual? Are they still training? Because the reality is fewer than 3% of people actually keep it off for 2 years or longer. I mean, if they can and they have, good on you, but that's not most people's experience because you have to do something pretty life altering that is going to be difficult to sustain. Like I could see someone getting motivated for like a wedding and doing that, right? But like doing it casually during COVID.
I think it was just kind of like, working in the restaurant industry, when you are just at home all the time and, if you don't cook or something, but then I guess to answer your question, it didn't stick. So
it never sticks.
Told me that in the beginning, but yeah.
It never does. Yes. All right. So at what point do you feel like the habit started to click for you? Like what's the approximate timeline? Because we talked about having worked together for about 18 months. I know it was well before the year mark for you, but do you feel like there was ever a turning point where it's like, okay, things are starting to feel easier. It's starting to feel a little more like seamless these days. I'm not having to think about it as much.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly when, but I think to your point, before a year, because you do it so effortlessly. And then when you do hit those occasional rough spots, be it a stressful day or, something that kind of throws you off, that's when I kind of realized how effortless it had been previously, because then I was like, oh, okay.
You're always focusing on what's going wrong. Not what's
totally.
Going well.
Yeah. Those are the times, like it's the tough times where you're like, oh, like I'm feeling the inkling to eat and I'm not hungry. Like, guess I just need to like hone back in on my habits. And so it's, I guess that's when you take another 2 steps forward, because honestly, that's when I realized that I was like, oh, I've done this. It's not that hard. I mean, it is hard, but I had practiced. So.
Well, and that's the name of the game. And you and I spoke on the phone every single week. So it was like constant reinforcement that like, no, you're not doing this wrong. No, you're a student. Yes, you're allowed to screw up. Like, this is what it looks like to be a beginner at something. This is what because, we think that
yes, I was that needy. Absolutely.
No, you weren't. But I mean, like we talked a lot, right? And we had some solid conversations, I think, around expectations, timeline, and, weekly, what are the challenges? And some of them are habits and some of them are environment, as far as like I was mentioning earlier, socializing, going out to happy hours. I know your work is very social, so you are expected to do a lot of sampling and taste testing events and things like that. So like those were kind of spontaneous challenges along the way that we had to figure out, like, what is this going to look like for you? And because you are a bit of a foodie, like there was a lot of restaurant dining on top of you working in a restaurant. So, everybody thinks that would immediately equate to a bunch of weight gain. But the reality is that wasn't really your experience. I mean, when we first started the program, it's normal for maybe people to gain 3 to 5 pounds initially. But what I always say is like, would you be willing to gain 5 pounds if it meant you could lose that 5 pounds plus whatever, and then effortlessly keep it off for the rest of your life? I mean, I would take that bet every single day. But it's very uncomfortable maybe while you're gaining that initial 3 to 5 pounds. Not everybody does. And I don't really recall you doing that, but like, did you remember having any weight gain in the beginning when I started to invite you or encourage you to bring in these off-limit trigger foods into your meals daily? I'm like, hey, we're going to go all in on the foods that have been a big no-no in your dieting history and start learning how to interact with it in a healthy way.
I did not notice that, no. And I think the reason is because I didn't really appreciate or understand how much I was actually eating before we started working together. Like I gave the like salad and then like afternoon snack and like everything. Like it's the things that you don't think count that you're just eating a ton of.
Baby carrots, they'll get you.
Yeah. I mean, trust me, I was not eating baby carrots. It was more like there's leftover cheese plate. Okay. Because it didn't count. It was just like a pass through. But yeah, once I could actually have whatever I wanted for lunch or breakfast or whatever, then I didn't want all this other food. So I was actually kind of realizing that I was eating less, at least less quantity wise. Like, I mean, I wasn't really counting calories, but I just wasn't continually eating, even though when I did eat, I'm sure it was a little bit more caloric than before. So I really didn't notice.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the scale weight, because that's not something that I really ask my clients to monitor throughout the program. I'm not interested in the physical as much as I'm interested in the mental, because I know where the mind goes, the body will follow. So if you are in a stressed or maybe depressed or whatever headspace, then that means you're more likely to turn to food to comfort. So I really like to understand my client's emotional state, but also, I mean, because we weren't stepping on the scale like most diet programs ask of you, did you find that you were able to see maybe more non-scale victories or monitor your behavior more through habit tracking and behavior tracking, as opposed to like, oh, this is the be all end all. I lost a pound this week or I didn't lose a pound this week, so I'm either passing or failing at all times?
I took it really seriously when you told me not to look at the scale. To be honest, I was glad you did that because it was super triggering whenever I looked at the scale. And so if I could feel like, oh, Leslie doesn't want me to, and I'm a people pleaser, so I have to follow her rules, I was glad to follow your rules on that one. And yeah, I think
tracking like your daily wins help you.
I think so. I think it's hard for me to acknowledge like when I've done something right. And so I think you and I talking through stuff helped me a lot more than just like seeing things, because I would always harp on like what I did wrong. And so the non-scale victories were helpful, but it was more you and I like talking through what that actually meant and, how that impacted my life, Like, oh, Jessie, I see you've gotten, like going back to the sleep thing, like I see you've gotten at least, 7 hours of sleep this whole month. Like, that's amazing.
Right.
And I was like, you know what? You're right. And I feel great because I'm not crazy tired all the time. And that means I'm, actually thinking about more decisions that I'm making. And, I'm not just running myself ragged. And so, yeah, the non-scale victories were what won out in the end, but it was definitely a struggle getting myself to that place.
Right.
in order to,
Yeah, well, it
get
doesn't
over
come
that.
naturally. That's why we work on it with our clients, because we want to help you, again, acquire this mindset of like what's going well instead of what's going wrong, because one perspective is very motivating while the other just makes you feel like shit all the time. And if you're in a positive headspace, then you're more likely to create positive outcomes in your life, right? So we want to constantly be reinforcing the good. And it's also important for an emotional eater to develop that skill as well, because if you're an emotional eater and you're always, again, in this headspace of like, poor me, or I'm a victim, or I'm having a really hard day and can't see like the but my life is excellent or amazing in X, Y, and Z ways, then like you're kind of screwed. So you have to learn how to become a new person and think differently. And that's just a small exercise that we ask of our clients, because it really starts to turn an I can't attitude into an I can. So we have
That was
to
key for me. Yeah. I needed that.
So I want to know how your relationship with food is different today than it was. Like, I want to hear a little bit about maybe the holidays and your social eating. I mean, we talked briefly about your wedding, but that's usually a time when you would feel like a lot of pressure to kind of fit into a dress, and you're going to be the center of attention and everybody's eyes are going to be on you. So like, how did that play into this whole thing, Jessie?
Yeah, I think that getting married and like having a dress to fit into, a couple dresses, obviously, there's like the rehearsal dinner dress and all that kind of stuff. But that was definitely, it was not nothing, because I had gotten myself into such a good headspace where it was like, you know what, I'm going to fit into whatever. Like if I need a bigger size, then I'll buy a bigger size, which obviously never happened, but that's where my head has been at for a long time. And so to change that and not have that be the case, I did buy a pretty expensive dress and it does need to be worn like on this date. And like I had my final fitting. So, that's what's happening. I think it did introduce a little pressure. But that being said, I had already, you and I worked together. We had stopped working together a few months before my wedding.
Yes, several months.
Yeah, several months. And, before that, as you mentioned, I had been kind of doing my habits consistently then. So it really just took that I can attitude in order to just fight off that pressure. Because, I'm not going to lie and say that it didn't exist. It, of course, existed. But I think it was helpful that every time I had that inkling to like, oh, Jessie, maybe you should have a salad today. It's like, you know what? Like, do I want a salad? Because if I don't want a salad, like, I know what's going to happen here. So, I'll be honest, some days I wanted a salad, and that's where I've gotten to, throughout this process. But I remember the weekend or two before our wedding, I like made baked ziti for dinner. And I sent it to my uncle who had given us like the casserole dish as a wedding gift. And I was like, you know what? He's probably like, why are they eating ziti like before the wedding? And then I was like, but what am I supposed to eat? Like just chicken and broccoli for every meal, as you always say? Like, no, it's crazy. So yeah, my relationship with food, not luckily, I'm proud to say, I'm very stable, trusting in myself still at this point. And yeah, it's been a long road. And I honestly even at the wedding, we had the most amazing food. And I can honestly tell you, it was not the most important part of the day. And, we went to France for 2 weeks on our honeymoon, and no better food than in France. But I can honestly tell you, I didn't feel out of control once. Yeah. I enjoyed every minute of it. Every bite of baguette, every croissant, every piece of cheese. It was incredible. And I honestly don't think I would have enjoyed it as much had I not practiced my habits and gone through this process.
Do you feel like when you came back from your honeymoon, was this thought of like, okay, now I have to quote unquote, like get serious or buckle down or, kind of like these old dieting scripts that we have in the back corner of our minds, they start to surface still. I mean, I still occasionally have them and I'm like, I catch it and I'm just like, oh, brain, you are so silly.
I'll be honest, I definitely was craving vegetables.
Yeah.
It wasn't like I need to restrict myself. It's like, I've been eating all butter. So it was kind of like almost like a natural, like, this is what I'm in the mood for now. But I honestly can tell you, like, I didn't feel the need to restrict myself after that. Cause I never felt like I went overboard, and even if I had, I'm just not, I don't know. One doesn't cancel out the other, it's just life now. Obviously would not have said this like 3 or 4 years ago, but that's how I feel. I don't know. And I'm happy to say it. So
good. So a couple of last questions for you. What do you wish you would have known at the beginning of this process that you know now? So if you could go back and give like former Jessie advice on day 1, what would you tell her?
Definitely like patience, grasshopper kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because Rome was not built in a day. And then really just to like lean into it and take care of myself and not worry about like if it's going to come off as weird to other people, or because that was, I don't know, like it's not, like nobody cares. And I remember like listening to some of the podcasts and I was like nervous to like see like who would be looking at me listening to something on the subway, and it's like, who cares? Nobody cares. So yeah, I think I would just tell myself that do whatever you need to do and don't like lean into it, trust it, take your time. It's worth it.
Yeah. I'm curious, but now you're like making me think, because it's true. I always kind of tease my clients about if you're not the dieter at the table, like you're going to be the weird one. As you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, it's a way to connect. Dieting is a way that we bond. We kind of commiserate over our cellulite or our jiggly arms or whatever. This is how women form relationships with one another. This is how they strengthen their bonds, is by like hating on their bodies. And I think it's super dysfunctional, but it is the reality of many, which is why I'm such an advocate for finding a support group or a community of like-minded individuals, because you're going to change and you need support along the way, because it can be uncomfortable to establish boundaries or maybe to speak up and say, you know what, I'm good. I don't need the second serving. Thank you, to maybe your boyfriend's mother who you're meeting for the first time. And that's awkward and uncomfortable.
Yeah, I've been there. Yeah.
All these scenarios. Yeah. I mean, people don't think about this, but this affects the way that we eat. We are influenced by our environment and the people in our environment. So I think this program really highlights or brings to the surface of like all the times you say yes when what you really mean is no, but you don't want to step on anybody's toes, or you don't want people to think more of you or less of you, or whatever story you have in your mind about what they're going to think of you if you eat the burger or if you don't eat the burger. I mean, it's exhausting.
It's quite exhausting. And I think to your point, like it's not made up. Like sometimes people actually do care.
Yes.
And you're right. Care. Yeah. Dieters. Sometimes they don't care. But
no, I'm just saying like anyone who cares is a dieter. They come from like their own background of dysfunction with food and exercise. And if they are going to say something to you, I guarantee you whatever is going through their head about themselves is 10 times more abusive than anything that's going to come out of their mouth about their own bodies. It's just projection, which is why I just have a lot of empathy, because I'm like, oh, I know if you're saying that to me, like you've got to really be hating on yourself hard. Because I just know how much more toxic we are in our own heads than we are willing to verbalize, right?
Speaking firsthand, I was so mean to myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then
you successful.
Exactly. And then you just shift it, but a lot of people don't.
Never. They'll go their entire lives focusing on the food instead of realizing that they have like this really loud, mean jerk, their inner critic that really is calling the shots, and they listen like completely. It's like we're powerless against it because we don't see it as a separate voice from our own. We think it's our own voice, and this is why we spend time in the program naming it and trying to understand that that is not your voice and separating yourself from it. All right. I'm rambling, Jessie. Reel me in here.
You're allowed.
All right. Last question. My biggest, well, I should probably say your biggest or client's biggest fear or our listeners' biggest fear. I know for me, this was the biggest fear was, okay, if I don't have any more rules, and I'm going to try this hunger-directed eating approach where I kind of wait until I'm hungry and like try to be in tune with what my fullness feels like. I was terrified that I was going to gain weight, and not so much terrified of the weight gain. I was more terrified of what the weight gain would mean about me, what people would see me, and I was no longer credible. I was no longer attractive. I was no longer... I was like glutton. I was lazy. People would form these unsavory opinions of me. So my real fear was not the weight gain. It was what society would start labeling me as and how I would feel rejected. I would be an outcast. And as human nature, we all want to fit in. We all are biologically wired to be accepted in the group. And so that was my fear. And that's going to be the biggest fear of many of our listeners is like, if I gain weight, then I'm not going to get X, Y, and Z thing in my life. So what advice do you have for our listeners who might be feeling this way or who are scared to even take the leap of faith in trying something like this?
I think it kind of just goes back to what you said before, is that you're the last resort. I hate to say it because there's really nothing that I can say to anybody to assuage whatever like fears they have of like being an outcast in society. Like that's just something that, like, if that's something that you're really thinking about right now, then first of all, food's just like never gonna like, that's just so far away from food. I guess I would just say that, you're doing what you're doing for a reason. You have thousands of people like me who honestly credit you for like my day-to-day life and peace of mind and my happiness to a certain extent, So I think, if somebody's feeling wishy-washy, I mean, hey, try something else. See if that works for you, because I'm betting it won't. And eventually you'll just make the leap because you have to.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just a different route, and I know that many dieters have been trying the same thing as I did over and over and over and over again. And I always kind of was able to successfully bullshit myself into thinking that like on Monday morning, I was going to magically wake up with some kind of like willpower gene that I lacked on Sunday evening or Saturday morning or Friday evening. And that's like, you know what? Maybe this really isn't a food problem. Maybe this is just me. I knew that self-sabotage was a big part of it, but I didn't know how to like stop it. I think that for me is like, I see the cycle, I see the pattern, but I didn't know how to stop the pattern. And
Absolutely.
So that's when you start doing the deep dive into learning about self-sabotage. And in conjunction with that, I also wanted to learn what healthy eating habits look like. And so my nerdy ass started researching look, I know that dieting, I've seen the statistics, I've read it over and over again, it doesn't work. But I want to figure out what the 3 to 5% who are successful, like what are they doing? Like they know something. They know something that the rest of us do not know. I needed to know what the secret is because it wasn't going to be in a supplement. It wasn't going to be in a detox. It wasn't going to be in a cabbage soup diet. It wasn't going to be in me because I tried all of that and it wasn't in that.
Yeah.
So the change needed to happen from the inside out. And I think those are all the components and elements that I've tried to bring into the program. Is now, Jesse, unfortunately, you didn't get to do the body image work as a client, but it's still available to you in the group now, which is huge. I didn't realize how huge that was. So that was like, beginners just not knowing. So I'm grateful that I evolved in that way. But then the habits of a quote unquote naturally thin person. And then you got to do the emotional, the psychological work. Those are the 3 pillars, I think, in any program. And if your program doesn't want to talk about how you feel or what you think, and it just wants to talk about food, then you're screwed. Sorry, you're wasting your time 100%.
It's just the same thing over and over again.
It's a calorie deficit, repackaged, resold in a different bow. So, Jesse, I don't want to cut you off, but any final thoughts or words before we kind of get this show on the road here? Wrap it up.
No, I hope everybody who's listening enjoyed it, and I hope people take you up on your amazing program. I have loved seeing everything evolve and just getting better. So
yeah, I am super excited because it has gotten so much better. And I have a team behind me who are such rock stars. And we've taken the feedback from previous clients who've been like, you know what, I didn't like this, or I needed more of that. And we're like, okay, we can do better. Thank you for your input. So we didn't even launch a program this summer. And I was just like, nope, we're going back to the drawing board. We are starting from the ground up. We're going to do this damn thing and we're going to knock people's socks off. So I'm super excited about it. And you are the first client interview leading up to the launch. So thank you for being a guest, Jesse. Thanks for coming onto the podcast and sharing your story, which I know will resonate with many. It's always a pleasure to have clients on. It's my favorite episode.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. Thanks, Leslie.
All right. Thanks to our listeners for joining us this Monday. There'll be another episode with another client the following Monday, and I'm super excited to share that episode with you as well. But Jesse, you're always a gem. Love catching up with you. It's been fun to follow you on your Instagram stories. I feel like we're still, connected in that way, but I'm also maybe revealing how big of a stalker is. So I will just end the podcast here. Everyone have a great week. You too, Jesse. Thanks for joining me on today's episode. If you're loving the Fat Murder podcast and want to take our relationship to the next level, then you could become a Friends with Benefits by receiving my weekly newsletter at www.lesliehooper.com. I also drop a ton of free content on Instagram, so be sure and check me out at hooper.fit. Thanks again for listening. I hope you'll join me next week for another thought-provoking conversation.